In towns and cities across America, a silent plunder is taking place. Main Street businesses, the lifeblood of our communities, are falling prey to a powerful force: private equity firms. These financial behemoths, with their vast pools of capital and insatiable appetite for profit, are transforming the economic landscape, often leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. From supermarkets to hospitals, factories to nursing homes, no industry is immune to their reach. Private equity firms operate in the shadows, far removed from the public eye. They swoop in with promises of growth and efficiency, but their real goal is often to extract as much value as possible, as quickly as possible. This often comes at the expense of workers, consumers, and the long-term health of the businesses they acquire. The future of our economy, our communities, and our democracy may depend on exposing and demanding accountability for their actions. Private equity firms are often portrayed as savvy investors, masters of the universe who can unlock hidden value and revitalize struggling businesses. While there may be some truth to this, the reality is far more complex. Private equity's playbook often relies on a combination of financial engineering, aggressive cost-cutting, and a relentless focus on short-term profits. One of the key tools in their arsenal is leverage. Private equity firms typically use large amounts of debt to finance their acquisitions, saddling the target companies with mountains of debt. This debt burden can cripple businesses, forcing them to make drastic cuts to stay afloat. Workers are often the first to feel the pain, as jobs are outsourced, benefits are cut, and wages are stagnated. They charge their portfolio companies hefty management fees, transaction fees, and monitoring fees, siphoning off profits that could otherwise be reinvested in the business or returned to workers. Consumers may face higher prices or reduced quality as companies cut costs to meet their debt obligations. At the heart of private equity's business model lies a powerful and often controversial tool: leverage. This financial alchemy allows firms to acquire companies many times their own size, using borrowed money to amplify their returns. While leverage can be a powerful tool for growth, it can also be a dangerous weapon, magnifying losses and putting companies at risk. Private equity firms typically acquire companies using a combination of debt and equity. The bulk of the acquisition is financed through debt, which is secured by the assets of the target company. This means that the acquired company, not the private equity firm, is ultimately responsible for repaying the debt. Interest payments on the debt can consume a significant portion of the company's cash flow, leaving less money available for investments in growth, research and development, or employee compensation. In some cases, companies are forced to take on even more debt just to meet their existing debt obligations, creating a vicious cycle of financial engineering. Companies saddled with debt may be more likely to cut corners, delay investments, and prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The story of Marsh Supermarkets, a once thriving grocery chain in the Midwest, offers a stark illustration of the potential downsides of private equity ownership. Founded in 1931, Marsh was a beloved local institution, providing jobs for thousands of workers and serving as a cornerstone of the communities it operated in. However, in 2006, the company was acquired by Sun Capital Partners, a private equity firm, in a leveraged buyout. At the time of the acquisition, Sun Capital promised to revitalize Marsh and position it for future growth. However, the reality proved to be far different. Sun Capital saddled Marsh with a significant amount of debt to finance the acquisition, which immediately put pressure on the company's finances. To meet its debt obligations, Marsh was forced to make drastic cuts, closing stores, laying off workers, and selling off assets. In 2017, the company filed for bankruptcy, ending its 86-year run. The Marsh Supermarkets saga is a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of private equity ownership. One of the most common criticisms leveled against private equity firms is their tendency to engage in aggressive cost-cutting measures after acquiring a company. While some degree of cost optimization is to be expected in any business, critics argue that private equity firms often go too far, stripping companies down to the bone in an effort to boost short-term profits. These cost-cutting measures can take many forms. One common tactic is to lay off workers, often in large numbers. Private equity firms may also outsource jobs to lower-cost countries, cut benefits, and freeze wages. Another target for cost-cutting is often the company's investments in research and development, marketing, and capital expenditures. However, cutting back on these investments can have long-term consequences, making it more difficult for companies to innovate, compete, and grow in the future. Critics contend that these measures often come at the expense of long-term sustainability, employee morale, and the overall health of the company. The relentless pursuit of efficiency and profitability in the world of private equity often comes at a steep human cost. Behind the spreadsheets and financial statements lie the stories of real people whose lives are upended by the decisions made in corporate boardrooms. From factory workers to nurses, truck drivers to retail employees, the human toll of private equity's practices is often overlooked and underreported. One of the most immediate and devastating consequences of private equity ownership is job loss. As firms seek to cut costs and boost profits, layoffs are often seen as a quick and easy solution. Beyond job losses, private equity ownership can also lead to a decline in working conditions. As companies are squeezed to boost productivity and reduce costs, workers may face increased workloads, longer hours, and pressure to do more with less. Benefits may be cut, wages may stagnate, and workplace safety may be compromised. The social fabric of communities can be torn apart as people struggle to make ends meet and face an uncertain future. Private equity firms often portray themselves as value creators, skilled investors who can unlock hidden potential and transform struggling businesses into thriving enterprises. However, critics argue that the value creation narrative is often an illusion, masking a more extractive reality. One of the primary ways private equity firms claim to create value is through operational improvements. They argue that their expertise in areas such as cost management, supply chain optimization, and pricing strategy can help companies become more efficient and profitable. However, critics contend that these operational improvements often come at the expense of workers, who may face job losses, wage cuts, and increased workloads. By leveraging their access to cheap debt, they can recapitalize companies, extract dividends, and engage in other financial maneuvers that can boost returns for investors. However, critics argue that these financial engineering tactics often create the illusion of value creation rather than real, sustainable growth. The vast majority of the profits generated by private equity investments flow to the firm's partners and investors, while workers and communities often bear the brunt of the costs associated with their ownership. Debt plays a central role in the private equity playbook. Firms use borrowed money to finance their acquisitions, amplify their returns, and extract profits from the companies they control. While leverage can be a powerful tool, it can also be a dangerous one, creating a debt trap that can cripple companies and leave them vulnerable to economic shocks. When a private equity firm acquires a company, it typically loads the company up with debt. This debt burden can have a significant impact on the company's financial health, diverting resources away from investments in growth, innovation, and employee compensation. Instead, a large portion of the company's cash flow is directed towards making interest payments on the debt. In some cases, private equity firms may engage in a practice known as dividend recapitalization. This involves the company taking on even more debt in order to pay a dividend to the private equity firm and its investors. The heavy debt burden imposed by private equity firms can have a number of negative consequences, including increased risk of bankruptcy and a culture of cost-cutting and short-term thinking. The private equity industry's reach extends far beyond the borders of the United States. From Europe to Asia, Latin America to Africa, private equity firms are scouring the globe in search of investment opportunities. While their proponents argue that they bring capital and expertise to underserved markets, critics contend that their activities often resemble a global pandemic of predatory finance. In developing countries, private equity firms often target companies in sectors such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. These sectors are essential for human development and social progress, yet they are often underfunded and poorly managed. Private equity firms see an opportunity to profit from these inefficiencies, but their involvement can have unintended and often negative consequences. One concern is that private equity firms may prioritize profits over the needs of the communities they serve. For example, a private equity firm that acquires a healthcare provider may be tempted to cut costs by reducing staff, limiting services, or raising prices. These actions can have a detrimental impact on the quality and accessibility of healthcare for vulnerable populations. The private equity industry has long operated in the shadows, shielded from public scrutiny and regulatory oversight. However, as the industry has grown in size and influence, so too have calls for greater transparency and accountability. Critics argue that the lack of scrutiny has allowed private equity firms to engage in risky and often harmful practices with impunity. One of the main challenges in regulating private equity is the industry's complex and opaque structure. Private equity firms are typically structured as partnerships, which are not subject to the same disclosure requirements as publicly traded companies. This lack of transparency makes it difficult for regulators to track their activities, assess their risks, and hold them accountable for their actions. Despite these challenges, there is growing momentum for greater scrutiny of the private equity industry. Policymakers, regulators, and civil society groups are increasingly recognizing the need to address the risks posed by private equity and to ensure that its activities benefit society as a whole. The private equity industry sits at the nexus of a broader debate about the role of capitalism in society. As the industry has grown in size and influence, so too have questions about its impact on inequality, sustainability, and the common good. Critics argue that the pursuit of profit without regard for its social and environmental consequences is unsustainable and ultimately self-defeating. There is a growing recognition that a more responsible form of capitalism is needed, one that balances the pursuit of profit with a commitment to social justice, environmental sustainability, and the well-being of all stakeholders. For the private equity industry, this means adopting a more long-term perspective, investing in companies that create good jobs, support their communities, and operate sustainably. It means prioritizing the interests of all stakeholders, not just investors and fund managers. And it means embracing transparency and accountability, engaging with workers, communities, and policymakers to address concerns and find common ground. The transition to a more responsible form of capitalism will not be easy. The future of our economy, our society, and our planet depends on our ability to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. The private equity industry stands at a crossroads. Years of unchecked growth and influence have fueled a backlash, with critics demanding greater transparency, accountability, and a fundamental reassessment of the industry's role in society. The future of private equity hinges on its ability to adapt to this changing landscape, to embrace reform, or face the prospect of revolution. One path forward is for the industry to embrace meaningful self-regulation. This would involve adopting stricter ethical guidelines, increasing transparency, and addressing the concerns of workers and communities. Another path forward is for policymakers to step in and impose stricter regulations. This could include increasing disclosure requirements, limiting the use of leverage, and strengthening protections for workers and communities. The choice facing the private equity industry is clear: reform or revolution. The industry can choose to embrace change, to become a force for good in the world, to use its capital and expertise to create shared prosperity and a more sustainable future.